Naveed Mansoori is a political theorist of media, religion, and dissent with a specific focus on the contemporary history of modern Iran. He received a PhD in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles in 2019. His dissertation, Propaganda After Prophecy, right, The Politics of Truth in Contemporary Iran, 1941 to 2009, was supported by the Elahe Omidayar Mir, I'm butchering this, I'm sorry, Jalali Fellowship for Excellence in Persian Studies. It demonstrated that propaganda sought to restore faith in the world and erect it anew. His current book project builds upon his dissertation to ask, how do people engage in politics when formal political institutions are absent or are considered illegitimate? This project situates contemporary Iran in a conceptual landscape that encompasses post-war French and German political thought, as well as anti- and decolonial traditions of political theory in the Third World, including but not limited to the Middle East. It draws upon literary, oral, audiovisual, and digital archives, framing mediascapes as terrains for informal pedagogy, subject formation, and insubordination. For example, an article published in Theory and Event, Things Unheard, Popular Silence, and the Popular Voice in Revolutionary Iran, lends an ear to the ideologue of the Islamic Revolution, Ali Shariati's lectures to theorize political science as a tacit disagreement to the state, right? Political silence, as tacit disagreement to the state. That article is part of a chapter that observes an insubordinate soundscape that invited audiences to engage in negative protest or a general strike against politics. Mansoori has published in Theory and Event, Comparative Islamic Studies, Reorient, a Journal of Critical Muslim Studies, and Society in Space. He has forthcoming work in Philosophy and Global Affairs, the Globalizing Political Theory Reader, L'Esprit and Libération, an Ali Sharati Reader, and an edited volume on prehistories of 9/11. He is co-editor of the Routledge Handbook on the Lived Experience of Ideology. Mansoori is also co-editor of Jadilia's Iran page. He's also a fellow. This year he is a fellow at the Princeton Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies, And before that, he was the ACLS Emerging Voices Fellow in Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab at the University of Virginia. Today, he is going to present a talk to us entitled Organs Without Parties, the Crowd and the Leader in the Iranian Revolution. And I'd like to ask you all to help me welcome Naveed Mansoori. Thank you.
Thank you. So first, of course, thank you to Ed Kazarian for inviting me to Rowan, to everyone who I have not met who've given their time and labor to make this space possible, and everyone and all of you for coming today. The topic of today's talk is political media in circumstances when there is either an absence of political parties or where political parties are widely considered to be illegitimate. I introduce and elaborate upon the concept of the party organ without a party, political media that operates as if it were a party organ despite the absence of the party for which it speaks. I argue that political media is compelled to compensate for the lack of parties that reflect popular desires. To make this argument, I will focus on post-revolutionary Iran. I am first going to orient us historically, since this might not be familiar terrain, by introducing key events and actors before entering the body of the talk. Briefly put, in December 1978, there was a general strike and mass demonstrations that culminated with the end of the monarchical Pahlavi dynasty. In early February, the Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran after 15 years of exile to guide the revolution. In April 79, Iran became an Islamic Republic. Regardless, crowds continued to amass in the streets in the name of an ongoing revolution. The first decades of Iran's 20th century saw an erosion of belief in party political activity prompted by the failure of parties to represent a well-defined, real, and mobilized popular constituency, to build a popular nucleus of support, and to achieve organizational cohesion based on a dedicated and sufficiently large membership. The Tudeh Communist Party was the most successful party of the 1940s until it was banned in 1949 by the second and last Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty, Mohammad Reza. Mohammad Mossadegh formed the National Front in 1959, an umbrella organization of factions that was invested in Iran's self-determination, its central aim the nationalization of oil. Though undeniably a political force, it never became a formal party. In 1953, the UK and the US ousted Mossadegh. The Pahlavi state was antagonistic towards parties after the coup. In 1957, the Shah permitted the formation of a two-party system with a liberal Mardom, or the people, and a conservative Milliyun, or the nationalists. In 1975, the Shah banned political parties altogether, forming a resurgence party as a means of restoring people's linkage to the state. Despite the absence of political parties, opposition was able to organize. The mass demonstrations that unfolded in 1978 were aided by a publicity network. That publicity network cohered in part around an increasingly blurred distinction between newspapers and party literature. There were 64 periodicals in circulation with 6 daily newspapers. When the Pahlavi state eased its restrictions in August 78, the Tudeh Party and the National Front, among other organizations, republished their party organs despite not being operational political parties. The main daily newspapers faced pressure to become party organs. By the mid-1970s, the two most widely circulated newspapers, Ittila, or Information, and Kayhan, or Cosmos, became perceived as mouthpieces of the Pahlavi state, in part because of government influence, in part because they rarely published criticism of state policy. By 1978 and 79, readers turned to foreign sources, mostly clandestine radio, to follow current events. When the police forces of the Pahlavi state, the Savak, fired on a crowd in Jale Square in February 78, journalists went on strike because the main dailies remained silent, inaugurating a wave of strikes that culminated with a 2-month strike in early 79 as a response to censorship. The spring of freedom began when the Savak eased its restrictions, after which clerical elite began to complain that coverage of the ongoing revolution gave too much credit to secular forces. In February 1979, shortly after Khomeini's return, the new leadership took over state-run radio and television, naming it Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting, or IRIB, and confronted the press head-on. Kayhan gave into pressure to act as an organ of the revolutionary Muslim people, such that in mid-March, editorials described it as an organ of the Islamic Revolution. Later, journalists learned that the association driving that change was backed by the Islamic Republic Party, the new state's short-lived response to the Resurgence Party. From 1980 to 1983, I'm missing a slide. From 1980 to 1983, the Islamic Republic carried out a cultural revolution to Islamicize the educational system. Crucially, the new leadership saw media as a subset of education. During the Cultural Revolution, the state purified Iranian media. The philosopher Ahmad Fardid was the spokesman of the Cultural Revolution. Before the 1979 revolution, Fardid coined the neologism West-strickenness to diagnose the contagion of Western modernity and its nihilism. Beginning in 1984, Fardid delivered lectures on state-run television. There, Fardid addressed what he saw as a problem. The revolutionary masses were nihilistic. They embodied the Islamic Revolution despite their ignorance. Khomeini was to guide them from nihilism towards piety. In his televised lectures, we gained insight into the anxieties and insecurities of the post-revolutionary state. Fardid framed mass media as a terrain with contending sources of political leadership. A notable example of a contending source of leadership was the morning newspaper Ayandegan, or Posterity. Established in 1967, Ayandegan was, in the words of its founding editor, a liberal newspaper with the aim of elevating political discourse in Iran. Despite that, or because of it, it did not side with a specific party or organization. From March to May 1979, Ayandegan changed into a paper that no longer disavowed its aspirations for the revolution's future, culminating with the Islamic Republic stopping the presses in August. Its transition from a neutral paper unfolded at a time when oppositional parties were either absent or did not have actual political power. Its transformation also unfolded in the context of the Islamic Republic's efforts to weaponize media as its ideological arm, evinced by purges of troublesome staff of both Kayhan and Itilat. While the organs of resurgence, the Tudeh Communist Party and the National Front, were vestiges of defunct political parties by 1978, in 1979, Ayandegan began to operate as the party organ of an invisible party, anticipating its potential emergence. That transition occurs most clearly during and after the coverage of the first International Women's Day, off the heels of Khomeini's call for the enforcement of the veil, when the headquarters of Ayandegan and IRIB became battlegrounds over the aim and end of the 1979 revolution. This talk will proceed in 3 sections. First, I stage a debate in contemporary political theory concerning the relation of crowds and media and leaders to foreground my argument that media in contemporary Iran, and perhaps presently, act as guides. I then turn to Fardid's lectures, where he saw the indeterminacy of crowds as a problem and media as a contending source of leadership. I conclude by examining how state-run and oppositional media covered the first International Women's Day after the end of the Pahlavi state, documenting how members of those crowds mobilized to compel oppositional press from representing the revolution to emulating its ideal. In turn, how oppositional media, here Ayandegan, was compelled to answer in kind. Overall, I argue that oppositional media assumed the form of a party organ despite the absence of a party. In this section, I frame my argument that political media is compelled to compensate for a lack of political parties in a conversation concerning the indeterminacy or fundamental ambiguity of crowds, and debate over if crowds need leaders and what leadership looks like. I here anticipate my investigation of post-revolutionary Iran, since the leadership of the Islamic Republic viewed the indeterminacy of the revolutionary masses as a problem to be resolved and saw media as a public university that had the capacity to turn the crowds into a faithful community. I suggest that media was a terrain where contending sources of leadership abounded. It could almost be said, John McClellan writes, that political theorizing was invented to show that democracy, the rule of men by themselves, necessarily turns into rule by the mob. The well-known frontispiece of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan is a vivid depiction of the conceptual location of the crowd in his narrative of the movement from anarchy to statehood. In the Hobbesian narrative, the sovereign is a crowd popularly represented. It is a singularity that contains multitudes, and so is and is not a crowd. The crowd is its body, but it is spiritually one. The generation of the great Leviathan, or rather, to speak more reverently, of that mortal god, Hobbes proposes, occurs when the multitude is so united in one person. In Elements of the Philosophy of the Right, Hegel sets the above narrative to the rhythm and flow of time. The earthly divinity of the state arises when particular self-consciousness has been raised to its universality, the actual unity of individual desire and rational interest. The crowd is subsumed in the state. Hobbes and Hegel's narratives are attempts at losing the crowd in the state by exercising a method of proving that crowds, by the force of reason alone, will attain statehood. Gustave Le Bon suggested that the state was lost in the crowd in his controversial The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind, investigating crowd psychology to account for the arbitrariness of their collective decision-making. In the era of crowds, the multitude united as a person. The divine right of masses, Le Bon proposed, is about to replace the divine right of kings. Crowds are only powerful for destruction, whereas civilization involves fixed rules, discipline, a passing from instinctive to the rational state, forethought for the future, and an elevated degree of culture. Where Hegel, in Philosophy of Right, and Hobbes before him, speculated that the crowd, by virtue of the cunning of reason, would become lost in the state, Le Bon claimed that the psychological crowd was distinctive by virtue of the disappearance of conscious personality when the feeling and thoughts of a collective attains a specific direction. Le Bon held that under the spell of words and images, the crowd could be hypnotized by demagogues with a knack for breaking and making the illusions that inspired crowds to take action. As an irrational actor, the crowd was susceptible to a leader who worked its irrationality. Freud reconstructed Le Bon's thesis in group psychology and the analysis of the ego, where desire, consciousness's movement towards its ego ideal, is mediated by an object and sustained by an erotic tie, not perception or reasoning. In Le Bon's phrase, Freud writes, the group has a thirst for obedience. The group identifies with an ego ideal, a leader. The primary father is the group ideal, which governs the ego in the place of the ego ideal. Freud strikes a Hegelian key, dissonant with Hegel's thesis in Philosophy of the Right about the rational kernel motivating crowds. Consciousness was tearing with its ego ideal, desires unconscious. In Phenomenology of Spirit, consciousness discovers the void when it seeks to understand the secret meaning of things, why they show themselves as they do, eventually learning the cause does not belong to things but to a source beyond what it can perceive. The mind experiences the void as nothing. In order, then, that in this complete void, which is even called the Holy of Holies, there must yet be something, we must fill it up with reveries, appearances produced by consciousness itself. The reverie temporarily satisfies the absence the mind finds in lieu of the cause, a prelude to its discovery that what it saw as the cause was its own uncanny reflection, the actual illusion. Le Bon and Freud's diagnoses that crowds consume illusions takes on new life in Marxist criticism of ideology. Marx claimed that Hegel's Philosophy of Right signaled the end of the criticism of religion in Germany. Philosophy must turn to the modern state, that is, the abstraction of actual man that satisfies the whole man in an imaginary way. Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer turned to the cultural reproduction of the abstraction of actual man. The loss of the support of objectively established religion did not result in cultural chaos, since culture infects everything with sameness. Where Adorno and Horkheimer saw stylistic diversity as reflections of a social substance, Guy Debord distinguished between the concentrated spectacle, the leader who was the guarantor of the system's totalitarian cohesion, and the diffuse spectacle, where irreconcilable claims jockey for a position on the stage of the affluent economy's unified spectacle. In Debord's analysis, the social substance was fractured. Culture was not a single production, but a terrain of contending spectacles. With the culture industry and its spectacles, it is the pleasure of aesthetic consumption, not fear of the state, that sustains statehood. The above accounts pose a question: are crowds what they eat? Does aesthetic consumption result in subject formation? Slavoj Žižek departs from the tendency to unveil the secret of the crowd, insisting that the concept of multitude qua crowd is fundamentally ambiguous. We cannot know what a crowd really wants, despite the appearance of its desire. The unconscious of the crowd is the show of an ego ideal. That ego ideal is persistently negative. So, how does the crowd become a people despite its fundamental ambiguity? Were Hobbes and Hegel right all along, if optimistic about the state's inevitability? Louis Althusser answers in the affirmative, though qualifies the traditional Marxist conception of the state as a repressive apparatus, as we know, with a state apparatus that functions through ideology, the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence with the ideological state apparatus. Though there are many ideological state apparatuses, Althusser follows Adorno and Horkheimer, insisting that despite its diversity and contradictions, they are united by the ideology of the ruling class. And yet, he also claims that these ideological state apparatuses are the site of class struggle. In a rethinking of Jürgen Habermas's account of the bourgeois public sphere, what Althusser sees as the communications ideological state apparatus, Nancy Fraser has brought to light the unofficial publics, or subaltern counter-publics, that engage in struggle and help expand discursive space, insofar as these counter-publics emerge in response to exclusions within dominant publics. After all, Fraser adds, to interact discursively as a member of a public is to disseminate one's discourse into ever-widening arenas. In the absence of a claim on state power, are counter-publics merely enjoying spectacles, and are they yet another object for aesthetic consumption as an opiate of the masses? With that concern in mind, Jody Dean suggests crowds are appearances, since they have a negative relation to interest. They do not know what they want. The crowd is not yet a people. It is a gap in structure or the positivity of negation. Dean calls for a party to guide the crowd dialogically towards peoplehood, affirming their fundamental ambiguity while retaining confidence in the possibility of mass politics. Dean affirms that the crowd is nothing. Yet, in the absence of a political party, the crowd is still something. In contrast with Dean, Judith Butler has proposed that crowds are not nothing. They are the desire for a livable life. In assembling, crowds make space for life itself to appear. Butler attends to crowds facing precarity. These crowds are asserting that they, those who speak then and there, are the people. Butler and Dean insist on two aspects of the concept of the crowd. Crowds are intrinsically nothing. Per Dean, they are a gap in structure, but they are not nothing. Per Butler, they are performative. I am interested in moments before the party in which either a party does not exist or there is distrust that parties reflect the interests of the people. As the premise of my contribution to this ongoing conversation concerning narratives of crowds as a people becoming. Though a crowd is not yet a people, they still act and speak in a way that resembles a people. Likewise, crowds are not merely revelations that appear, but are spectacles that are made legible. The open-endedness of their legibility as a people is occasioned by their fundamental ambiguity. The crowds become visible and legible in a heavily mediated, contested, and public plural space. How might a crowd guide its own becoming as a people, perhaps anticipating a future with the party in a circumstance in which radio, television, print, and otherwise are the spaces of their appearing? So here I propose that political media fills the absence of a party to determine the peoplehood of crowds, instead providing reflections of the crowd that occasion in turn contestation of their meaning for us. I now turn to the televised lectures of Ahmad Fardid, the spokesman of the Cultural Revolution. I show that Fardid and the followers of Khomeini, began to see mass media as posing a direct challenge to the Ayatollah Khomeini's status as the leader of the Islamic Revolution. Fardid was trepidatious in the face of the fundamental ambiguity of the crowds, since the crowds embodied the revolution, despite profound differences of vision among revolutionaries. Khomeini was to guide them from out of their fundamental ambiguity towards political unity. In the concluding section, I show to what Fardid was referring, the way in which political media was compensating for the lack of a proper political party that could claim the revolution as theirs. The Pahlavi state had attempted to create an official culture of spectacle in the 1970s, culminating with open attacks against cinema and television at the height of revolutionary fervor. In August 1978, arsonists set fire to the Cinema Rex Theater in Abadan, killing 400 people. During the general strikes of December, electricity workers blacked out cities in protest of televised propaganda. In February 79, the new leadership co-opted state-run radio and television, naming it Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting, or IRIB. The first director of IRIB, and Khomeini, described audiovisual programming as a public university. The self-professed spokesman of the 80 to 83 Cultural Revolution, Ahmad Fardid, began delivering televised lectures on Channel 2 of IRIB beginning in 1984. The new leadership co-opted the ideological state apparatus, taking off where the Pahlavi state ended. They portrayed Khomeini as the leader of the crowds, but was Khomeini emulating an emulation of the revolution's idea that crowds ought to follow, like a trustee, or was he a representative of their desires? The Khomeinists named Khomeini an imam. He was the source of emulation and, in the words of the historian Ervand Abrahamian, a demigod towering above the people and embodying their historical roots, future destiny, and revolutionary martyrs. Khomeini and Fardid disagreed. Khomeini saw the wretched and the barefoot as the revolution's bedrock. In the inaugural 1984 lecture of Fardid's television series Westricanness and its global crisis in the present day, Fardid addressed the relationship between crowd and leader on the premise that crowds were ignorant. This lecture set the tone for those to come as part of an effort to train the eyes of the revolutionaries. Even if crowds were overawed by the imam, they did not make meaning of his significance the same way. Fardid saw mass media, as I explained later, as a limit to the state's ability to master vision. In this lecture, Fardid bears witness to the fundamental ambiguity or indeterminacy of crowds, speaking directly to Gustave Le Bon's position that the crowd was an annihilating force. Fardid diagnosed Le Bon's thesis as a specifically Western mentality that was motivated to annihilate everything for the sake of self-interest. He coined the term Westricanness to name the contagion of Western nihilism. He claimed to have read The Crowd in his youth. One day, he said, he recognized its absurdity and threw it all outside. He tested Le Bon's thesis against the Islamic Revolution. The crowds were the positivity of a negative theology. The revolution, as Fardid saw it, was defined by the crowds chanting, "God is great." As such, the revolution was organized around the crowd's affirmation that they were mediums of God, the unknowable. Fardid saw Khomeini's return to Iran as a proper event that ended the age of Westricanness, where the negative orientation of the crowds could finally become converted into political faith. The revolution's reckoning began with the coming of the Imam Khomeini, he professed. I am of the belief that with the chant, "God is great," Westricanness passed. Fardid was nonetheless threatened by the fundamental ambiguity of the crowd, the necessary but inessential embodiment of the Islamic Revolution, and saw the Imam Khomeini as a virtuous and pious leader, authorized to guide them towards self-resolved and complete peoplehood. He delivered the first lecture a few days after May Day 1984, a day that recalled the turbulent early days of the revolution after Khomeini's return, when everything was contested. The short-lived Islamic Republic Party first organized rallies for May Day 1979. However, the party contended with even larger rallies organized by Marxist organizations. On the first May Day, Khomeini declared labor the manifestation of God. Labor was the bedrock of the new state. It was a stable foundation for collective interest. In the above terms, Khomeini represented the desires of the crowds, taking popular desire as an immediate revelation of collective interest. Fardid's reflection on Le Bon was a reflection on May Day. His suspicion of desire began where Khomeini's ended, the unconscious of desire. In the time of the past and of the crowd, Fardid professed, it was not the time for religion and society, for spiritual and temporal authority to be unified. Fardid expressed trepidation in the face of what he named the interiority of the soul, the unknowable. He saw socially productive labor as an act of divine creation mediated by the interiority of being. In those terms, Khomeini emulated the idea of the revolution to regulate a libidinal economy. Fardid hoped Khomeini would convert desire into interest. Beginning in 1981, the state banned opposition from organizing May Day rallies. In 1984, a year after the official end of the Cultural Revolution, the state had captured May Day. The Islamic Republic's policy of media censorship reflected its policy of crowd control, that is, a policy of assembling a multiplicity of elements in a fashion that corresponded to the idea of the revolution. The leadership of the new state had a two-pronged problem. First, a media landscape that was populated by sounds, words, images, and messages that redirected vision. And second, a national viewership of emancipated spectators who looked at the spectacle actively, where in the first lecture, Fardid diagnosed the fundamental ambiguity as a problem to be resolved. He now reflects on the spectacle as a leader or guide competing with the Imam Khomeini. Fardid addressed the relationship between the Society of the Spectacle and the Islamic Revolution in a televised lecture in January '85, as part of his investigation of a West-stricken Iran. In Fardid's vision, the revolution was fascinating. It was not a specter, but a glow. The intensity of its glow could blind vision, thus the need for Khomeini to guide them as a source of emulation, and thus also the trouble with other lights, shows, and spectacles. And short spectacles. Fardid names these other lights, shows, and spectacles sedition or fitna. The seditious spectacle dissimulates rather than emulates the idea of the revolution by way of spurious etymological reasoning. He related the Arabic fitna to the Latin fascinatio and English fascination, and to the Greek basanos, meaning torture and trial. The spectacle was a test. The West-stricken was a seditionist. The seditionist created spectacles that tested the resolve of the world of the spectators. Fardid did not leave his audience with the comfort that they had correct vision. He stated, "Even I am stricken by sedition." And since they were stricken by sedition, they would need to follow the light emanating from the source of emulation and to be judicious about those in their midst who fluttered about other lights or who sparked them. Fardid perceived the relation between television and viewers parallel to the relation between leader and crowd. He saw that the backlit screen of the public university was drowned out by other luminosities. The concentrated spectacle of the leader was diffused in mass-mediated society, reflected in the myriad possibilities of how the crowded revolutionary scene might become a state. Fardid described mass media, which he pronounces in English in the above terms, reconceiving mass media as sedition, as a popular technology, and as the mediation of the people. There are two senses in which man is a seditionist, Fardid professes. In one sense, with the so-called collective messages, mass media, mass, meaning of the people, media, meaning technology. In any case, this mass media on a planetary scale is collective mediation, which includes television and radio. Fardid remembered and acknowledged the alternative sources of guidance in circulation. The state had party organs, reflections of the concentrated spectacle, the imam, but there were others. On March 8th, 1979, millions of Iranians participated in marches for International Women's Day. These were the largest demonstrations since February. They were spurred into motion by Khomeini's decision to enforce the compulsory veil and continued for 6 days. Khomeini and his followers were not united. Neither were women's organizations. Noted clerical elite disagreed with Khomeini's decree, and furthermore, as Behruz Qamari Tabrizi observes, women's issues continued to be addressed in the frame of revolutionary politics, nationalism, class struggle, and anti-imperialism. Some organizations were outright critical. In late March, the National Union of Women described the demonstrations as a distraction against the struggle against imperialism. The crowds on March 8th thus appeared within a heavily contested visual field. Afsan Najmabadi notes that anxiety about the westernization of women was widespread. In the 60s and 70s, intellectuals in general saw the West-stricken woman as overly sexual and vain. In this reinscription, Najma Abadi explains, the West-stricken woman embodies a double other, the enemy within, fitna or sedition, and the enemy without, the West. On these terms, she cautions readers from taking at face value the modernist narrative that presence that views presence as freedom proper and absence as its negative. Rather, she draws attention to how women in Iran struggled to be legible to various publics. The open-endedness of the legibility of the crowds on International Women's Day evinced the indeterminacy of the crowds more broadly who gave body to the 1979 revolution. And in turn, these crowds appeared as objects of reflection and contestation over the meaning of the event. Ayandegan's coverage of International Women's Day was committed to representing the desires of both participants and spectators while disavowing a party line. Their report the next morning described the day's decline into violence when proponents of the compulsory veil attacked those marching. The report followed with a list of chants the journalists documented, as well as a poll taken during the protests of those opposed to and against the veil, with a group of people who either participated in them or witnessed them. Here the chants are not the univocal "God is great" Fardid bore witness to as giving expression to the promise and potential of a unified revolutionary subject. We are the neither the veil nor abuse, independence, freedom on the one hand, and we are the adherents of the Quran. We do not want unveiled women on the other. In the poll, most interviewees stated that the compulsory veil did not befit a free society. One participant stated, "I am opposed to dictates of any such kind. This too is an affront to freedom." Others defended Khomeini's decision. State-run television did not cover the event until the evening of March 11th, when Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting reluctantly broadcast a short segment with footage of a few veiled women chanting salutations to Khomeini, greetings to freedom. Crowds gathered outside the headquarters of Ayandegan and IRIB to protest their coverage of March 8th. On March 10th, supporters of Khomeini's decision gathered at the newspaper's headquarters chanting, "We are the adherents of the Quran. We do not want unveiled women in neither East, neither West, but an Islamic Republic." They also called for the purification of the press. On March 12th, just 2 days later, a crowd assembled before IRIB headquarters to protest their coverage the previous evening. Head of IRIB declined to comment. Head of televised news stated, "Don't expect an answer from me because I have nothing to say. I can only say this, that with a complete broadcast of incomplete footage, we have made our policy known." An employee confided that they had created a 20-minute segment, but IRIB refused to run it. That same day, a crowd gathered in front of Ayandegan's headquarters chanting, "Ayandegan, Ayandegan, the newspaper of the outsiders." The crowd demanded the newspaper take a position in response to the crowds of March 10th. The newspaper accompanied their picture of the crowd taken from the second story of their office, stating, "Ayandegan is the guardian of freedom, specifically the freedom of women." Thereafter, Ayandegan's policy to remain politically neutral became increasingly difficult, since state-run media refused to provide coverage of what the paper saw as a multi-tendency movement. On March 20th, Ayandegan provided coverage of an unemployed movement that began in earnest on March 2nd when laborers on strike aired grievances before the Ministry of Labor, calling for more jobs, a 40-hour work week, organizing space, and unemployed benefits. Ayandegan quoted an unemployed worker on strike, Zahra Dorostak, who complained about IRIB. Dorostak echoed the crowds that had gathered outside Ayandegan headquarters just 8 days prior. "I want to know why radio and television do not publicize our grievances to inform the world of our sufferings," she said, "and to make them appreciate how little the authorities are offering us. If they broadcast these injustices," she continued, "the people will no longer be misinformed by the government that pretends to give us our due." By giving coverage to the unemployed movement, the many demonstrations on the street, Ayandegan was making the multi-tendency composition of the revolution legible, contradicting IRIB's efforts to show that the revolution was an uncontested response to Ayatollah Khomeini's call for the unity of the word, or for political unity. The unemployed movement culminated in the May Day protests, the largest demonstration of 1979, with hundreds of thousands of participants. The newspaper's one-page spread the next morning demonstrated how its commitment to descriptive coverage of the revolution was partisan, anticipating Fardid's anxiety about the poverty of viewing labor as an immediate manifestation of God. By May Day 1980, the state banned political parties from organizing rallies altogether. The article documented every locale that served as a point of departure for various marches and attendant organizations, followed with a list of placards their journalists saw, along with a list of slogans. The article's penultimate section was on the protests of the Islamic Republic Party, their placards and slogans, and yet it concluded with the sections of the protests of the National Mujahideen, a militant Marxist and Islamic organization vehemently opposed to clerical rule. In substance and style, Ayandegan was writing the crowds into a multi-tendency revolution, marginalizing the Islamic Republic Party as one public among many. Conditions for nonpartisan coverage of the revolution were foreclosed. The paper was now legible to its public as a party organ, reflecting the speculative unity of the crowds on the streets. Ayandegan was at the beginning of its end. On May Day, the noted cleric Mortaza Mutahari was assassinated, prompting Ayandegan to complement its May Day headline with news of his death. There was widespread curiosity about his assassins. Soon after, an Islamic organization, Furqan, claimed responsibility. Just 8 days later, Ayandegan published a report on the organization, explicitly stating that the paper was opposed to violent protest. But even so, Khomeini was displeased, since Ayandegan exposed that there were ideological differences among politically engaged Muslims, stating that he would no longer read the paper. In response, the paper released an issue composed of 3 white pages with a single article on the front page titled, "Should Ayandegan Continue Publishing?" On May 31st, Ayandegan resurfaced. In a brief column, "The publication of Ayandegan will continue," the editors addressed if they were a political party. What did Ayandegan say, and what does it want? From the second half of the 19th century, when the foundation and thought of modernization was discovered, until today, when we have cast out a ruling dynasty from the throne of power, and the revolution must pursue uprooting the monarchical order, we have not had a real and massive party or syndicate or political multitude that has even arrived at the stage of seizing power or getting close to participating in it. It is not the fault of the people that they continue dividing the universe and the cosmos and the nation and the people into the incomplete and meaningless duality left and right, and who predominantly do not have but a general and vague image in their minds. The fundamental condition of a political party is acquainting the masses of people with a political line and the course of the movement of society based on their desires and interests and the balance of forces. Without organization or a party, political work and the founding of the country will not cohere, and without acquaintanceship with the votes and convictions and supporters of any of those, a party will not come to be. Amidst the current revolution, the work of informing and raising the awareness of the people to the wide spectrum of political lines is the responsibility of the presses. Ayandegan has known itself bound to tell the people what is happening in the country so that the reader discovers what course the social movement is taking. Only after this acquaintance and awareness can the people take part in a political movement, to proceed to express their desires and defend their interests, to resist, to agree, to advance, to accept, to dismiss, and to declare their presence in society. Ayandegan's role as the organ of a future party shaped its content. In an essay published 5 days after they resurfaced, Ayandegan observed that in the past few months, one women's movement after another has declared its existence, referencing the demonstrations on International Women's Day. What becomes apparent from the statements and writings of these movements they wrote is that the foundation for unity for a great many of these organizations is great. We strive in this report to introduce these movements and their aims. 2 days later, they published a follow-up, The Women's Movement is the Continuation of the Revolution. In the next 3 months, Ayandegan continued covering demonstrations, and there were many, against censorship, imperialism, unemployment, with massive crowds gathering in the name of an ongoing revolution. Ayandegan aspired to become a medium for the crowds, the embodiment of the revolution, so that they could guide themselves until the day they would be able to participate in the state or to seize it. In August 1979, the Islamic Republic no longer abided Ayandegan. In a dramatic event, the state shuttered the morning paper's doors, foreshadowing the cultural revolution to follow. So I began this talk by introducing the problem of the crowd, the relation of that problem to media, and contemporary debate over how the crowd becomes a people. I followed by examining the televised lectures of Ahmad Fardid, the self-professed spokesman of the Cultural Revolution, who acknowledged mass media as contesting the concentrated spectacle of the Imam. And I concluded by showing how the otherwise politically neutral Ayandegan was compelled by the exigency of circumstance and agitation by its publics to become the party organ of a future party. In post-revolutionary Iran, the anarchy of epistemic authority that is plaguing contemporary politics was intensely apparent, where Ayandegan was forced to navigate a familiar circumstance. This talk is not normative. It is not prescribing a party organ for an invisible party. It is rather suggesting that at a time when parties are absent or when there is widespread distrust that they represent the desires and interests of constituents, media begins to fill that lack. Such attention to media that serves as the organ of a political party that does not exist may clarify their relation to formal institutions and invite consideration that they are doing more than enjoying the right to speak, as well as consideration that epistemic error or bias is a surface show, a symptom of a deeper crisis evinced by current events where a hitherto novel crowd formation, invited to amass by seemingly fringe news outlets and relatively charismatic leaders, attempted to seize state power. Thank you.
So I've got a, call out online for questions. What do people have to ask Dr. Mansoori?
Okay. So I'm going to do the terrible thing where I pick.
So when you had the May Day poster up there and talking about labor as the manifestation of God, I saw that the caption said, such hands will never go to hell.
Yeah.
Wow. Also, which seemed to loop into me, and tell me if I'm wrong, this idea of nihilism to piety, the sort of taking Marxist, atheist, labor-ish, like, not directly, but that sort of vibe, and co-opting it specifically for religious language as salvific. And I was wondering if you could talk more about the phrase, such hands will never go to hell.
Yeah, I don't know the province of that particular phrase, aside from a poetic person who made a poster for the march. But I do think that there is something deeper there, which I wouldn't, because I think there's a tendency to talk about sort of the way in which it's like the formulation would be like, oh, Marxist language in Islamic garb, something like that. And I think that kind of privileges one language as the lingua franca, and like that, and the other as kind of a vernacular. And I would rather think of it as opposing and contending discursive traditions. So that there was a kind of back and forth between Marxists and, it's difficult. The way in which these formations sort of become distinguished are in historiography made to be, it's like these secular Marxists and these like Islamic conservatives or whatever. But I think the relationship with them is like a much more sort of complicated than that kind of opposition sort of gets to. I think that one thing, though, that comes out of debates around and something I've been thinking of is that the sort of charge that the Marxists were materialists was pejorative, was sort of like a pejorative, right? And so like, but what was it? What was actually at stake in calling someone a materialist? And I think it's and I think in maybe a way that's familiar to us, it has to do with sources of authority. That the transcendence, right? The transcendental as a source of authority, and the way in which materialism became sort of materialism became sort of legible as making a claim about immanence that rendered any claim to something outside of it as the supernatural and as something like a delusion, right?
Yeah.
And so there, in the sort of debates about labor as the manifestation of God, to say it's a material, right? To say that, to make a claim about nature, right, or like the physics as a realm of immanence, was also a way of actually claiming that anybody who was trying to make derive authority from a source outside of it was sort of enjoying a reverie, right? And so I think that's sort of what's happening in the contestation over May Day and the idea that labor is a manifestation of God, right? It's actually trying to say that, well, we have Khomeini, and Khomeini is here, the embodiment of this thing that's exterior to the immanent frame. Right, yeah.
So I have a question from Joshua Gedacht, and his question is, how does your framework for making sense of media and crowd change with the advent of social media in later decades? How does that altered media landscape interact with future events like the Green Movement and mass protests? Thank
you for that question. That's great. I think that what I've been thinking about with social media is in a way, like trying to deep dive or think seriously about the status of the influencer, which would be basically like certain kinds of charismatic leaders that can attain kind of following outside of formal institutions. So for example, we know that in 2016, someone basically tweeted their way into the White House. And I also think about it as sort of occasioning new forms of collective and public intimacy. One thing I would say that the social media question raises is something that is basically, well, so there's like One American News, there's Newsmax, there are these they have a more traditional media form, but the way in which information is sort of consumed these days is not necessarily bound to that. Like there's a way in which those kinds of sources have become secondary and I think something that would be worth responding to or thinking about, it might just be too soon to make a definitive claim, is how these two things are operating. Is like something like OAN and Newsmax are like my hunch is this, that these are basically reacting to how chaotic information is flowing in social media, and it's giving it a kind of organization. And there might be something like a mimetic relation between these things. But it seems to me that, so I mean, it's kind of that thing where like Foucault said in the future will be Deleuzian or something. And I wonder though if there is a way in which the sort of arboreal structure of the party organ is enduring and maybe not giving way to the sort of rhizomatic sort of way in which information flows in digital space.
Because of the influencer in particular having that kind of like reimposing kind of that degree of sort of hierarchy or sort of centeredness around. Okay,
right, that
makes sense. Joshua says thank you. I was trying to see if there was a follow up.
Sorry for asking a question. I guess I could Google, but what ended up happening to like the people who ran the paper, and like were there other like do you think similar like media outlets fulfilling the same role, or do you think it's important that like they were the only one?
The editor ended up going into exile in Europe and trying to start a liberal party from abroad. So the story actually confirms. Like he wasn't even like sort of thinking of that, but then like through the experience of through this experience, he ended up going abroad and actually starting a party that was like by its nature displaced and alienated from actual political power. And then the 80s were like difficult times. The 80s were difficult times, and actually, but one thing that can for publishing within Iran, except for that very strange, the Spring of Freedom, but people were still able to communicate to people in Iran, like leftists or whatever, through like clandestine radio, for example, was one of the ways that people would do that. And then basically by the early 90s or so, sort of you have the beginning of satellite television, and that opens up a whole new way of communication from outside of the sort of evading the censors, and then later the blogosphere and this or that. But after like that strange sort of period from February to August, within Iran, I think you stop really seeing a lot of like actual like publications, and people have to become very creative as to how they were communicating with people who were in the country. Yeah. It would actually be very difficult to Google that information, by the way. Yeah, it wouldn't be very easy to find on Google. Yeah.
There's not. You want to go? Okay. Let me go.
Sure, if nobody else. Thank you.
Sorry. Take care, Brett.
Okay, first of all, thank you for this talk. I thought this was really interesting. And so I guess I have kind of a boring question, but I'll have a reason why I'm asking the boring question, if that makes sense. So the question is, what is your definition of media, and is it more confined to sort of large-scale institutions? And the reason I ask that question is if we have a very expansive definition of media, then I'm afraid the thesis might end up being almost sort of true in a kind of trivial way, like just any person who like I start a Substack, right? And then a lot of people read it, and I'm, defending a perspective that's not represented by either major party. Then on some level, I'm a media figure representing a party that doesn't exist yet. So I'm worried if the definition of media is too big, then just anybody who gets a following will sort of de facto become a media figure representing a party that doesn't really exist, and the thesis might end up being true in a kind of boring way. So that's what I'm worried about.
Right, yeah, that's a good, if I were deductive. But I'm inductive. So I look at the way in which certain kinds of media forms become privileged, and right? Because the relation, what constitutes media, right? I mean, we can look at like microwaves, right? You're right, it can become really boring and expansive. But it is true that not in a particular cultural historical moment, people aren't like as worried as people right now aren't as worried about, I don't know, like a radio as they are about social media, right? Like there is a way in which the answer to the question is one that is coming out of the archive. And that's the way in which I'm thinking. I'm thinking about the definition of media inductively. So I'm looking at the particular media forms that are actually being legible and like registered as the media forms to be concerned about. And then thinking it from there, rather than sort of trying to deduce by way of something like a transcendental deduction, a definition of media that can then universally apply to everything. By which point, you're right, it'd be dizzyingly complex because it could be so many different things. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
The method is inductive on that. Yeah.
I'm going to ask mine, or it's not very well formed though. But I'm interested in this kind of form giving sort of thing that's sort of, so floating through this is this kind of, you did this whole long section on this kind of contested ontology of the crowd and its relationship to both kind of political institutions as possibly one way in which it gets form, or maybe other kinds of coherence that don't necessarily have to be totally institutionalized in this way. And I guess my question is, and then you kind of tag that into, well, media understood in this kind of inductive way becomes sort of something alongside the state, right? That's what the example of Iran teaches us, right? Is in the revolutionary space, right? Media becomes this thing alongside the state that can potentially play this role. Right. So I guess what I'm asking, so this much is clear, right, is, how do we understand what media is cohering? right? In other words, are we cohering something that's going to get institutionalized, or are we more like perpetuating and mobilizing something that still works like a crowd in a way that resists institutionalization, right? So part of your thesis was, the future party, right? But the future party isn't really here yet. And so what's at stake in that? You see what I'm getting at, the kind of ambiguity there?
Yeah, begging the question of the state, maybe? Like at risk of begging the question of the state?
Or even just... I don't know the institution has to be convergent with state here, although obviously that's one direction in which it can go, right? But part of what you were also saying is, right, the crowd is sometimes a nothingness of institutions, right? It's something that decomposes them as much as it recomposes them.
Right.
So I'm wondering, like, I'm thinking in particular of the way in which sometimes what's happening, especially in the recent stuff, is it becomes almost mobile, like the media that's playing around with the crowd, and it becomes almost mobily dismantling any kind of institutional convergence, right? As much as anything else, it's actually preventing something from cohering and continually destabilizing, and capturing a relationship that way to the crowd.
Right. That does make sense, yeah. And I think I would say that, I think that mediascapes are like maybe anarchic and indifferent to the state, and indifferent to the state probably like in a way that's conceptually prior to how they become problematized by people both within them and by the state. And I think that's the way I would think those two together. It seems certainly that you don't have to maybe like beg the question of the state to say that like Ayandegan was always already, going to become a party, to sort of see the ways in which, because the memory of the party as the ideal sort of political form that might provide people in a real and perceived way, it might not be right, but that might provide people a way to participate and power to seize it. Right. That it created a point, it sort of occasions media as a reaction to that perceived absence. Right. And so I'm just trying to attest to moments where the memory, right, where the memory of, it's like it's a phenomenological almost. It's like there was a moment where historically the state had just denied parties, and there was so much sort of like in the chapter that precedes this, I sort of talk about how for this like 5-year period, the left was still really invested in parliamentary and electoral politics, and they kept saying, like, please, like, reassemble parliament, please allow us to have parties. And after a while, they were like, I think that it's time for armed struggle, right? And so, but that's not to say that, but that the memory of that sort of the coup, the memory of that time where like there was like something we would call civil society was there, and it was this kind of like a thing there was a sort of nostalgia for it. And I think that nostalgia is doing kind of political work.
So that's what's kind of like occasioning the almost the coherence of a sort of, a mediated moment, right? That it calls something into existence, right? I like this idea that it's actually something like those conditions, including those memory conditions and those that call media into existence as much as media kind of are doing, because often we think about it as much more of a top-down organizing function, right? But something else is happening as well, right? Which is that's really interesting.
So this is badly formed, and it's also probably the opposite of my previous question, but
just go on both.
But I'm just trying to cover all the bases, I guess. So, but yeah. And if there's anything online, go ahead. But I guess my question would be something like, so we have this case with Ayandegan where you have a crowd, and then it seems like the media institution sort of comes after to represent some of what the crowd is doing. But maybe there could be cases where it's sort of the other way around, where like maybe the media kind of creates its own constituency in a way. And I'm thinking of cases like there's that recent book, it was a couple of years ago, I guess by now, but Democracy for Realists, Akins and Bartels, where they argue, well, there are a lot of ways in which the average person sort of takes their cues from elites, right? Like, if you code a policy proposal as being associated with a certain group or party, they'll be in favor of it, but the same policy proposal, and you associate it with the other group they don't like, they're now against it. And so how does that, maybe, could there be cases like that? Does that fit into the analysis in an interesting way? Or I'm just wondering, it's not a well-formed question.
Of media creating its own constituents?
Yeah, or like maybe, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of like Lenin's party and party literature, right? You're creating your own constituents. That's what party literature does. And I mean, part of this is taking sort of like Lenin's party and party literature, and rather than reading it as a call for, taking that as actually a insight to think about what political media that maybe we might not like is doing, right? Like maybe we can think of OAN as sort of like an answer to something like what Lenin is asking for in party and party literature, to sort of manifest constituents into being, right? Like forms of counterinterpolation, things like that. And so I mean that question is precisely what I'm trying to actually give an account of, or to show that this was actually happening at the time. So, thank you. Yeah.
Cool. And ask everyone here to thank Naveed for this wonderful talk and really stimulating. And thank you everyone for coming, and we will have another program of these next semester.